What is up, guys? Welcome back to another UFC video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about fighters that I think will never win again inside of the UFC octagon. Now, I'll start off by saying that I don't have a dislike for any of these fighters. I don't hope that they lose in brutal fashion or anything like this. I really don't have anything against these guys, but I'm just being brutally honest here, and I've seen guys talking about fighters that are going to fall off in 2025, guys that are going to have a bad 2025. I wanted to go a step further than that and talk about some fighters that I just genuinely believe will never win again inside of the UFC octagon before they lay the gloves down. So without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and get right into it. The first fighter I'm going to be discussing that I believe will never win again inside of the UFC octagon is going to be Kamaru Usman. Now, I'll also preface this by saying I'm not going to be talking about guys that are 40 plus years of age, that are coming off of a KO loss, that are most likely only going to fight one more time. Guys like Dominic Cruz, guys like Nick Diaz. Those are kind of cop-outs when it comes to this topic. I'm going to be talking about guys that are still relevant in their divisions and guys that I do believe are still going to fight 2 or 3 more times. And Kamaru Usman was the first guy that came to mind. Look, I do think we see Kamaru Usman fight 2 or 3 more times in the octagon, but I do think that he's going to lose all of those fights and then retire. Look, in my opinion, Kamaru Usman was always overrated. His best 3 wins of all time, let's take a look at him. 2 of them came before he even got the belt, over Leon Edwards and Sean Strickland, but they weren't in their prime at the time. His best win ever was over Tyron Woodley, who was still not washed at the time when Kamaru Usman won the belt originally. That was his best ever win. But realistically, in my opinion, I think that his championship run was incredibly disgustingly overrated. The fact that people were comparing him to George St. Pierre during the time period where he was about to fight Leon Edwards the second time was just absolute blasphemy, delusion to the highest extent. Usman is not even comparable to George St. Pierre in terms of their resume or their skill set. And look, take a look at his championship run. It's incredibly overrated. Jorge Masvidal is one of the biggest journeymen in UFC history. Half the roster has a win over George Masvidal. So I'm not taking that win too seriously. You know, the first fight was on short notice. All he did was really smudge him and step on his toes the whole time. And then the second fight was a good knockout. But, you know, that's Jorge Masvidal, a journeyman. His other 2 wins, you know, his rematch against Colby Covington, his 2 fights with Colby Covington. Fun fights. But look, Colby Covington's a guy that was also overrated as hell, had only ever beat washed up old fighters. And Usman made him look competent on the feet, which isn't a great look. You know, Colby Covington just really has never been that high level in my opinion. And people really thought that Usman and Colby were super high level for a long time, which I never thought. I never bought into that. So, you know, he had 5 title defenses. 4 of them just really aren't that impressive in my opinion. I think his best title defense was over Gilbert Burns. But still, I mean, Gilbert Burns, kind of a 50-50 guy and has been on a downwards trajectory since then. So the win isn't aging well. So 2 wins over Jorge Masvidal, 2 wins over Colby Covington, and a win over Gilbert Burns. That's not comparable to GSP in my opinion, and I think that is a ridiculously overrated title run. And it's just not super impressive for me, just in terms of the level of competition. And look, I've been saying this a long time about that generation of welterweight, that era of the welterweight division. It was a era of the welterweight division that lacked skillful fighters, and athletes were really just running the show. Usman being the main point of that. Look, he's a guy that has always relied on his athleticism. He's never had a great skill set. He's never had a great fight IQ. He's always just been a really good athlete. And I just don't think he's going to be able to lean on that to get wins anymore. He's coming back to a shark tank of a division. and he's still at the top of the division. He's only going to be fighting absolute killers, nightmare matchups once he comes back. And I don't see a winnable matchup for him in the top 10. Who's he going to fight? Sean Brady, Michael Morales, Jack Della Maddalena, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Carlos Prates? I think all of those guys smoke him. And I just really don't think he's ever going to win again before he retires. And like I said, I do see him fighting 2 or 3 more times. What Usman should have done was gone up to middleweight and fought a guy like Marvin Vettori, fought a guy like Nasruddin Imavov, maybe a winnable matchup up a weight division. That would have been his best bet. But he's made it pretty clear that he's going to come back to the welterweight division and fight these guys that are on the come up. And I think they all smoke him. His inactivity has expired him, in my opinion, and it's going to really show once he steps back into the cage. He's been fucking around, doing podcasts, with Henry Cejudo and not focusing on fighting. And that's really going to come back and bite him in the ass, in my opinion. He didn't fight a single time in the year of 2024. The ring rust is definitely going to be there for a guy like him who's not a super technical or skilled fighter in general. A guy that just uses his athleticism and pushes a pace. And of course, the cobblestone knees are going to be there. He has a lot of injuries piled up on him throughout the years of fighting and training. And I think it's all going to accumulate and absolutely destroy him, and his career is going to fall off a cliff once he comes back and fights again. Because like I said, he's only going to fight nightmare matchups and guys that are probably going to KO him. Carlos Prates, I got Carlos Prates by round 1 KO there. JDM, I got JDM either by late round TKO due to volume with the boxing, or just destroying him 30-26 and putting on an absolute boxing masterclass over Usman. I really don't see Usman winning any more fights in his career. I don't hate the guy, but I do think that he's always been overrated. Seems like a nice guy, family man and everything like that. Like I said, I don't have anything against these fighters, but he was always overrated. He's always relied on his athleticism, which he will not be able to anymore. All the guys that he's going to fight in the top 10 at welterweight will smoke him like a fucking joint. And the inactivity and the injuries, it's going to be too much. I think that we are going to see a Kamaru Usman that looks like an absolute shell of himself, which was never really all that great anyway, once he comes back to the octagon. And it is going to be a very, very quick and brutal fall off for Kamaru Usman. I think we see him lose 2 or 3 more times in the octagon and then retire. So unfortunately, I got Kamaru Usman for the first guy I do not see ever winning again inside of the UFC octagon. The next fighter that I believe will never win again inside of the UFC octagon is going to be Calvin Kattar. Now, Calvin Kattar, good fighter, good boxer, but he's on a loss streak now, and I do think we see him fight a couple more times in the octagon. He does have a fight booked coming up, but I think that he's just completely shot. You look at that fight versus Aljamain Sterling, he didn't even look confident enough to throw a 1-2 in that fight. And I know Aljamain Sterling is a great grappler and everything like that, but he just looked beyond washed in that fight. And in my opinion, kind of has an outdated style. He's always just kind of been a guy that relied on his boxing ability and has some wrestling that he can lean on, but he's always just kind of been a boxer, doesn't really use a ton of kicks, and he doesn't have a lot of depth to his game. And a lot of these guys in the featherweight division coming up now are super well-rounded, dangerous fighters, and they're just absolute nightmare matchups for a guy like Calvin Kattar. He's taken lots and lots of damage in his career. You think about that Max Holloway fight. I mean, that was just an absolute ridiculous level of damage. He was able to get a good win after that over Giga Chikadze, but I think that beating from Max Holloway really did a number on Calvin Kattar. Nobody can be the same after a beating like that. And not just in terms of damage via strikes to the head, but also just in terms of his athleticism and his body overall. Can't forget about that knee injury that he took against Arnold Allen. And I really do think that slowed him down a lot. Maybe he had further complications with that injury post-surgery, who knows? Maybe that had something to do with the performance against Aljamain Sterling. But I think that knee injury really, really hindered his ability to be athletic, to be able to sit down on his punches, defend takedowns. I think that absolutely cooked him in terms of his athletic ability and just his ability to push a pace. It seemed that he lost a lot of, the ability to stuff takedowns, especially against Aljamain Sterling. Kattar was always a guy that had pretty good takedown defense he could rely on, but I think that knee injury really took that out of his game, unfortunately, which is going to be a severe hindrance for him moving forward. And like I said, stacked featherweight division. All these guys that I think Kattar's going to fight now that he's kind of fallen off of the top of the division are guys that I think are going to beat him. Youssef Zalal, dude, is going to absolutely roll up Calvin Kattar and smoke him like a fucking joint, dude. He's going to butcher him. Zalal fights like a Tasmanian devil on meth. He's an absolute menace, super dangerous on the feet, has a submission game, ridiculously dynamic, cardio for days. Youssef Zalal is a nightmare matchup, and I think that Zalal is going to absolutely butcher and put a real beating on Calvin Kattar. And how many losses is that going to be in a row? 3 in a row now? It's not going to be good for Mr. Calvin Kattar. And look, he's going to lose this fight. I think he'll fight at least one more time after that. But who's he going to fight? Fucking Sean Woodson? Kevin Vallejos? Just absolute murderers on the come up that are going to stain him. Most likely, you know how the UFC does their matchmaking. They're going to give Calvin Kattar someone super dangerous, maybe John Silva, for example. They're going to give him John Silva. They're going to give him Sean Woodson. They're going to give him Kevin Vallejos, someone that's just super nasty that is going to go in there and box with him. And I don't think he's going to be able to keep up at this point in his career. So unfortunately, I do think that Calvin Kattar is going to lose to Youssef Zalal in brutal fashion, probably fight one more time against a Sean Woodson or something like that, and lose that matchup again. And I do see him retiring after that, unfortunately. Calvin Kattar, he's given us a lot of good scraps, been a mainstay in the featherweight division for a long time, but is a lot of negative things piling up for him, and I do think that he's lost that confidence. And that's really a really telling sign for a fighter in terms of how the rest of their career is going to go. When you see a guy that just simply doesn't have the ability to commit with his punching anymore or be strong with his takedown defense, once those type of things go in a fighter and they just have no conviction or confidence with the things that they're trying to do in the octagon, you can normally bank that they aren't going to have success going forward. So our next fighter here that I do think is cooked and is not going to win again inside of the UFC octagon, Calvin Kattar. The next fighter here that I will be discussing that I believe will never win again inside the UFC is Chris Curtis. Now, Chris Curtis, if you don't remember, at the end of that Brendan Allen fight, he went down screaming in pain. Originally, I thought it was a knee injury, but it was actually a hamstring injury where he fully ruptured it, I believe. And that is a absolutely detrimental injury to any athlete regardless of the sport. And especially in a sport like mixed martial arts, where a lot of it has to do with your explosive ability in terms of exploding into strikes, takedown defense. All of that comes from your legs and your hamstring and your hamstrings and your glutes. And now that he's had a nasty hamstring injury, he had to get surgery on it, I think he's going to look absolutely dog shit the next time he steps into the octagon. And look, realistically, he just isn't good enough for the next generation. And he's another one of these guys that are probably going to fight up-and-coming killers, like his up-and-coming matchup versus Roman Kopylov. I think Kopylov's going to do a fucking number on Chris Curtis. I think it's going to be a round 1 or 2 KO. Kopylov is a ridiculously powerful striker, nasty hand speed, really good timing, head kicks out the wazoo, some of the nastiest body kicks you'll ever see inside of MMA. And look, Chris Curtis, always been a guy that's overrated in my opinion. I mean, lost to Kelvin Gastelum, which isn't a great look, especially at this point in KG's career. Had a competitive fight with Marc-Andre Barriault. So if you need to have a gauge on where Chris Curtis is in terms of his skill set, if you're having a competitive fight with Marc-Andre Barriault, that really goes to show that you just aren't high level at all. People have been talking about Chris Curtis like he's some dark horse of the division for a while. I never got that at all. He just simply isn't good enough to be at the top of this division, and I think he's going to get smoked the next time that he fights against Roman Kopylov. I think Kopylov gets him out of there by a round 1 TKO. And then you're going to be looking at a hard-fought 5 rounds against Brendan Allen, who looked dog shit in his last fight as well. And losing that, got injured at the very end of it, coming off of a surgery now. He's going to be coming off of a surgery loss where he got injured, and then a round 1 TKO to Roman Kopylov. So already a guy that's kind of aging. I do think that Chris Curtis, he's probably going to get smoked by someone on the come up, Sharon Magomedov, somebody like this that is just a killer in the middleweight division. What's that one kid's name? Abdul Malik. I could see Chris Curtis fighting Abdul Malik. I actually do believe they train out of the same gym now that I think about it. So that matchup might not happen, but you get what I'm saying. He's going to fight guys that are just a higher level than he is. And I think that after the hamstring injury and the round 1 TKO via Roman Kopylov left hand, I think Chris Curtis is going to fall off and lose multiple times in a row and then retire. So yeah, Chris Curtis, I have been saying that I like most of these fighters and I don't have anything against them, but Chris Curtis is actually the only guy on this list that I just really don't fuck with at all. Chris Curtis just seems like an absolute crybaby, just seems soft as fuck. If you ever are just scrolling on Instagram and you look in the comment sections of a lot of MMA posts, you'll oftentimes see a smart aleck comment from Chris Curtis. Just, you know, Sean Strickland's little buddy. Both of those guys are just absolutely retarded. I could not stand being around either one of them. Imagine having to train with Sean Strickland and Chris Curtis on a daily basis. That would absolutely suck. Quick story time. I went to a VIP section of a UFC fight night, the Louisville card actually, and Chris Curtis, he was one of the fighters that were in attendance there. And look, I got pictures with OSP, I got pictures with Mark Coleman, some other guys that were there. Chris Curtis was the only UFC fighter that I didn't even take the time to talk to or get a picture with. I don't fuck with Chris Curtis at all. I don't think he's a great fighter. I think he has a bad attitude. And I think he's salty. So all these other guys, I actually somewhat hope they will win and at least get one more win in their careers. Chris Curtis, I actually couldn't care less if he gets fucking stained 30 times in a row. So yeah, Chris Curtis, I don't think he ever wins again. Super overrated fighter, shitty attitude. Sean Strickland's bitch. I think they both get KO'd in their next fight. So yeah, Chris Curtis, he's getting fucked up by Kopylov, and then he's losing a couple more times, and then he's going to retire or get cut. So yeah, Chris Curtis, fuck out of here, bro. The next fighter I think that will never win again inside of the UFC octagon is going to be Jared Cannonier. Dude, my boy Jared Cannonier, he's been having a rough go at it lately. He's probably actually my favorite fighter out of any of the guys I've talked about here. But look, Jared Cannonier, he does not have a chin left. He needs to chill out fighting these absolute killers. Look, he's been dropped by Derek Brunson. He's been dropped by Robert Whittaker. He's been KO'd by Dominic Reyes. He's been KO'd by Nasruddin Imavov. Early stoppage, but Imavov was going to get him out of there. Kyle Baralio knocked him down about 72 times in his last fight and broke his fucking nose. Snot and blood was coming out of it. It was a terrible look for Jared Cannonier. And he just gets hit nowadays and he instantaneously does the stanky leg. I really do think that his durability is absolutely gone. He's taken so much damage. I swear every time he fights, he gets clipped and he gets dropped. Aging fighter as well. I think the only fighter on this list that is over the age of 40, but still a guy that's been staying active. Look, he's on a horrible loss streak, and now he's only fighting killers. He needs to fight a guy that just isn't as dangerous as RoboCop, because he's fighting RoboCop in his next fight. And I'm telling you this right now, RoboCop is going to knock him out within 2 rounds brutally. RoboCop's been looking insane recently. Had an absolute masterclass over Christian Leroy Duncan, who's in his prime young fighter. RoboCop is the definition of a marauder, nukes in his hands, very good grappling, and he's basically the exact same type of matchup that Caio Borralho was, and honestly probably hits harder in terms of the boxing. So I think he has a nightmare matchup in front of him next time out in February against RoboCop. I think he loses by TKO there, and that's going to be 3 losses in a row, 2 by knockout, 1 by brutalization. So that's a fuck ton of damage that he's going to have taken just in this last year. And realistically, look, I like Jared Cannonier, but middleweight at the time where Cannonier, Marvin Vettori, guys like this were in the top 5, very, very shallow era of the middleweight division. And look, Jared Cannonier, former heavyweight, he has always lacked the technique to really hang with the top level fighters in this division. Izzy, Robert Whittaker, he was just never technical enough to be able to hang with these guys. One of the reasons why I picked Nasruddin Imavov and Caio Borralho over him and bet on both of those fighters there in that fight against Jared Cannonier, just doesn't have the technique, and he's also kind of slow. You can see that he used to fight at a heavier weight class, just with the eye test by how he throws his strikes. Not super clean, not snappy, really lots of effort in everything he throws, and that's really caught up with him recently ever since he's been fighting these super high level contenders on the come up. And he's also, even though he's a former heavyweight, not a big middleweight whatsoever, just, wasn't cutting weight at that point in his career before he came down to middleweight, is in good athletic shape, but a short guy for the division, isn't a guy that, I think rehydrates to a very, high weight when he, walks into the cage, has a long reach, but look, he's a short guy for the middleweight division. Let's just be honest. We saw that in the Izzy fight. We saw that in the Nasruddin Imavov fight. And I really do think that has hurt him, especially against these long, rangy strikers. And he has taken a lot of damage in those fights as well. But yeah, I mean, look, I like Jared Cannonier. He has always had a good attitude going into his fights, has always been a humble, just a good guy, a good competitor. But I think that the RoboCop matchup is the last thing he needs in his life right now. RoboCop is going to brutalize him to the highest extent, knock him out in the first 2 rounds. And I do think we see Jared Cannonier fight one more time after the RoboCop fight, probably just trying to finish out his contract. But unfortunately, I do think that Jared Cannonier just is not going to win again inside of the UFC, because middleweight, it's stacked. I mean, you got Shara Bullet Magomedov coming up. You got fucking Bo Nickel coming up, who's another dangerous striker that they would probably put Jared Cannonier against. Roman Kopylov after Kopylov beats Chris Curtis. So yeah, I don't think anything good is on the horizon for Jared Cannonier, and I do think that we see him lose to RoboCop, lose to a guy like Kopylov, and then unfortunately call it a day. So yeah, the Killer Gorilla, Jared Cannonier, I'm a fan of the guy, but I don't think he's going to win again inside of the UFC. The last fighter I will be discussing is going to be Pedro Munhoz. Now look, Pedro Munhoz, lowest ranked guy out of all the guys I've talked about here, and kind of the least relevant, but dude, Pedro Munhoz, he used to actually be like a gamer in the bantamweight division, but recently he's just been looking rough. The loss to Chito Vera wasn't great. Lost to Kyler Phillips, looked terrible in that fight. And then his most recent fight against motherfucking goddamn Amin Zahabi, aka Ariel Helwani. Ariel Helwani beat the piss out of Pedro Munhoz in his last fight. So it's not a good look to be getting beat up by a journalist. And Pedro Munhoz has the T-Rex arms, doesn't have a long reach. And look, in his last fight, it was just so weird. He looked like a fish out of water. Now, I picked Amin Zahabi to win that fight, but I thought it would still at least be competitive. Look, Ariel Helwani went in there and put on a boxing masterclass over Pedro Munhoz. And similarly to Calvin Kattar, Pedro Munhoz just did not have any conviction on his shots, didn't look like he had any type of confidence. And he had that kind of lost look in his eyes, fish out of water, deer in the headlights type of vibe that Calvin Kattar also had in his last fight. And like I said, once you see that lost look in their eye, just complete look of confusion when they're in the octagon, That's how you oftentimes know that a fighter is going to have a fall off and most likely not win again. He's taken a lot of damage in his career, been in a ton of wars, you know, slugged in the pocket with Cody Garbrandt for about 30 fucking minutes. Got the better of that exchange, but, you know, he's been in hella wars and he's taken a lot of damage. And look, he's in the bantamweight division, and he, like a lot of these other guys, he's going to get fed to the youngest, hungriest contender. He's super dangerous. He's just a classic stepping stone, unfortunately, and he's on a nasty loss streak already. I do think the UFC will keep him around just to feed him to contenders, because you know how those fucking awful people are up there in the UFC matchmaking office. I swear they just get off on feeding these older guys to younger contenders. It's sad, to be honest, but they're going to give him fucking Montel Jackson. They're going to give him Peyton Talbot. They're going to give him somebody that's just going to stain him in the first round, and I think that's going to be all they wrote for Pedro Munhoz's UFC career. So, unfortunately, I do see Pedro Munhoz being kind of similar to Calvin Kattar, just a guy that's like a fish out of water now, and he's going to fight nothing but young, hungry contenders. Cody Haddon, Peyton Talbot, guys like this, Montel Jackson, and I do think that he will lose those fights and either get cut or retire. So, yeah, unfortunately, Pedro Munhoz, I don't see him winning either in the UFC octagon ever again. If you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate you watching all the way through. If you enjoyed, leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I would appreciate that a lot. It means a lot to me. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching the video.